I am ready to go to work to serve you and to help lead Virginia for the next 4 years.
In tonight's editorial roundtable, the newly elected will soon head to Richmond, where they'll learn the difference between campaigning and governing. With a bare-bones budget, roadway gridlock, and job loss across the Commonwealth, 1,100 people out of work at this Franklin paper mill alone. This is what matters. Good evening, I'm Kathy Lewis. Thanks for joining us for another of our editorial roundtables. We like to switch up the voices from time to time to offer differing perspectives on the issues. And joining us this week, Virginian Pilot political reporter Julian Walker is with us, as well as from the Daily Press, our good friend Kimball Payne back with us as well. He also blogs at theshadplank.com. With us from a peninsula perspective, we have from the Daily Press columnist David Squires. Glad to have him with us tonight, as well as from the Williamsburg Yorktown Daily managing editor Kim Lenz. Thanks to all of you for being with us tonight. I have wanted to get this group together because we are heading into a General Assembly session shortly after we finish celebrating the holidays that will have no presents in it, I guess, for the new administration. Kimball Payne, what do you think? This budget mess is pretty significant, isn't it?
It's the overwhelming story of the General Assembly session before it even starts, just like last year, because when you're dealing with $3.5, $3.6 billion worth of holes to fill, you have to have a real look at where the state's going to spend its money. And so, McDonnell is walking into a very difficult budget cycle in a time when it's going to be talking about needs versus wants, cuts, trims, where you start and where you finish and what the role of state government is.
Yeah, and that role of state government is an interesting question. Julian Walker, it sounds like we could be getting ready to have a little bit of a dust-up when it comes to this transition on a number of levels.
Yes, the pilot had a story earlier this week about the outgoing administration of Governor Kane floating the idea of using the car tax subsidy that currently the state sends to localities as a possible source of revenue to plug some of those budget holes. Bob McDonnell, the governor-elect, has emphatically said that he, on the campaign trail and since his election, I am not in support of any kind of new tax levies, and that includes pulling back existing tax credits. So there is certainly the potential that Governor Kane could present a proposed budget later this month that is based, at least in part, on some tax increases or repealing of tax credits that then would put the governor-elect in the position of having to scrape it and start from scratch.
I think that's actually a very interesting point, because when that car tax was first repealed, that was the great fear of the localities, wasn't it? That, well, sure, you say you're going to give us you're going to reimburse us for the loss of those revenues, but you may not at some point. And so here we are with this conversation.
That's right. And I think the localities are really nervous about what's going to happen in Richmond, and they feel a little powerless because they have the legislative meetings and everybody trots out and they all smile, and really there should be a big box of tissues on the table, and they should be, really, really sobbing for what's going to be lost, because unless it just seems like something will have to go, and it will probably be a lot of funding to the localities.
But it's a great contrast for Kane to leave as he's leaving office, because we know local governments are going to be strapped. We know schools are facing cuts for the first time in a significant way from the administration. What Kane does is lay this against the other priorities. So even if he just puts it in and McDonnell strips it right out, it forces you to lay these things side by side and say, well, we're paying $950 million a year to fill this car tax hole that we said we would. What is that spending? What are we losing because we're paying that money back?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that's important is that because this is local, the Democrats and the Republicans are going to have to work together to solve this problem, not this craziness that we have on the national level with this gridlock.
And do you see that happening?
They're going to have to. The times that we're in now, they're going to have to work together.
And it's an interesting moment to be talking about this business of working together, because, boy, doesn't the Hampton Roads delegation look just a bit different than it did a year ago when we were heading into this General Assembly session. You have the loss of two very powerful lawmakers, one in the House, one in the Senate. Certainly Phil Hamilton in the House. We'll talk about that first, and then we'll come to Ken Stahley on the in a moment or so. What's the loss of Phil Hamilton mean?
Well, for Newport News, I mean, it's tremendous, and for the Hampton Roads in general, especially for like healthcare and medical. I mean, this is a profound change, and I think you have to look at it that Hampton Roads does not have a rainmaker in the General Assembly at this point. I mean, from you look back over folks who have held that position and who have been big-time players, and there's, we have guys like Hunter Andrews, Alan Diamondstein. I mean, these are people that were major players who were at the table for big decisions, and that's a benefit for Hampton Roads. And I think any leader in Hampton Roads has to be concerned of, where's my next crop? Because it's all about seniority. It's all about committee assignments, and the reality is, even if you're a freshman who won by a landslide, you're still a freshman. And
you're still someone to whom the House Speaker has said, be quiet, sit there and be quiet for your first year.
Freshmen are seen, not heard. Freshmen are seen, not heard.
And to Kimball's point, also remember, outgoing Delegate Hamilton is Vice Chairman of Appropriations. That is the Money Committee. That's where the big decisions are. And furthermore, Phil Hamilton was also a budget conferee. With the loss of Phil Hamilton, Hampton Roads now has one member on the Budget Conference Committee as currently constituted, Johnny Joannou. So it remains to be seen whether there will be some shuffling of the deck chairs and someone else from Hampton Roads will be appointed to the conference committee, whether it be on the Senate or the House side. But certainly that is another loss. The decisions about how money gets spent, the big decisions, Phil Hamilton had a big role in those.
And I guess that was the big thinking around election time, was whether the citizens of that particular district would decide that the value of what you're talking about is more important than what they were hearing about the situation with the job and the university and the rest. Were either of you surprised by the outcome of that election in that district?
Well, nothing really surprises me when the turnout is so low. So when you see a low turnout like that, you kind of think, well, this is going to play out in a different way. And I think that's where we're at right now. What was the percentage? It was, I mean, with 6,000 votes, you can go to Richmond.
I don't even know the number.
How about you,
the
David?
other thing is that Phil Hamilton, he's the guy who was liked by the Democrats and Republicans. And so a lot of the Democrats, a lot of people in the black community, with Phil Hamilton, has a big stature. A lot of people stay home. So a lot of Phil Hamilton's friends didn't go vote.
And the political intelligentsia saw the benefit of Hamilton more than the average voter. I mean, I spoke with plenty of people who said, listen, he made a mistake. I'm not downplaying his mistake, but we have to realize his role and his importance to Hampton Roads. It was the average rank and file voter who saw what Phil said in the newspaper, saw what he wrote in his own emails, and said, forget it.
Well, plus Robin Abbott, I heard the report that she visited people in her precinct 3 or 4 times. When I saw her at a recent event, she said that her people went to every household in their precinct 6 times.
Wow. You really have to work. Yeah, you really.
But it's an interesting point, piggybacking on the point that Kimball just made, that Phil Hamilton was known not only as a breadwinner and someone who brought home the bacon to his district, but also someone who was strong on constituent services. And what's interesting is the conventional wisdom was that the controversy that he was embroiled in was first revealed in late July. The thought was there's enough time for him to put this behind himself. It wasn't an October surprise. It was something that happened in July. And so I think more than a few political observers were surprised that he was defeated, particularly in a climate that was very healthy for Republicans.
Very, very interesting story. Of course, Senator Ken Stahley vacating his Senate seat to become the sheriff in Virginia Beach. What are the implications of that?
We're not without a Stahley in the General Assembly still.
Well, indeed so, because his brother Chris elected to the House of Delegates.
Well, he's just been a power player along with Senator Norman. I mean, you look at the landscape of Hampton Roads, and when Bob McDonnell spoke to the Republican advance in Williamsburg, he made a couple of points of reaching out, saying, working with him and working with Speaker Howell and working with Senator Norman, even though Senator Norman's the minority leader. I mean, I think Bob McDonnell realizes the importance of a power player, someone who's been around Richmond long enough to speak the language. And it's not an insult to freshmen, it's not an insult to the folks who ran on the peninsula against Phil, but I mean, if you saw Phil at the voter forums, he'd spent 21 years in the General Assembly and risen as high because of his ability to draw on all this knowledge, and that's just flat gone. So what does that mean for us?
Ken Stahley is the ultimate deal maker. When we wrote a story back in the spring about once he confirmed that he was in fact running for sheriff, one legislator in the House said to me, the 2 words you don't want to hear and he might have said 5 words, but the words you don't want to hear when it comes to your bill is Ken Stahley opposes it.
Wow.
Because he's the ultimate deal maker. Ken Stahley was both loved and hated for the fact that he had his fingers in so many pots and was involved in so many deals, even in beyond just his chamber in the Senate, but also in the House of Delegates.
Yeah, really, really interesting. The other thing that we heard some news on this week was transportation. Some pretty stark news in terms of what this region faces. Tremendous impact in terms of the cuts in transportation funding in this region, the worst hit region in the Commonwealth when it comes to that. I almost don't even like to talk about the projects anymore, because really, if there's not money there, you know, you sort of have to ask, what's the point? You know, after a certain point. But there's this very interesting proposal that Governor-elect McDonnell has put forward, which would essentially propose that you extend I85 lay it over 460 and essentially turn 460 into an extension of I85 from Petersburg into Suffolk, which would then elevate it to federal status, making it qualify for federal transportation funds. Kind of an interesting idea. What do you think?
Well, the governor-elect has, 19, 21 pages worth of ideas on transportation. I mean, he had no shortage of lines in the water for money for transportation. My biggest problem with something like that is that's playing SimCity with money you don't have. I mean, you want to make an extension, that's all fine and dandy. I mean, you give me a map, I'll draw you a great transportation grid, but if I can't pay for it, it doesn't matter.
I guess the thinking was these federal funds may be coming next year with the reauthorization of the transportation bill.
But the state is still going to have to step up, because one of the fundamental problems is matching money.
Right.
And we get, what, $3 back for every dollar we put in from the feds, and if we can't put that dollar in, I mean, you think it's bad now, it'll get way worse. So I think what you're going to see is McDonnell has to be creative and aggressive in getting anything done on transportation. If he wants to sell the state's liquor stores, to pay for transportation, I mean, he thinks he can get a $300 million to $500 million. There are questions about, giving away a revenue stream, but he's going to have to be tremendously creative and tremendously aggressive. And you've got the House flipping from no, we're holding back the line against Tim Kaine and Mark Warner to we're leading the charge against the Senate. So you've got two dynamics that both houses are changing dramatically. And I think what you're going to see is folks in the House trying to figure out a way to lead the charge for McDonnell, and folks in the Senate trying to figure out how to defend against the governor from the opposition party.
And dealing directly with your question about 460, the governor-elect has said that he wants to get federal tolling authority on 95 and 85 at the border with North Carolina. And one of the things that he is hoping to kind of predicate his argument on with respect to 85 is, well, we're going to make improvements on 85 and 460 at this junction. But I've spoken with the Federal Highway Administration on a number of occasions, and the bar is very high to get a tolling authority. You have to, one, be pledging to reinvest that money into the road that you're tolling, and two, more often than not, they want you already to have spent money on that road to justify your request for tolling authority.
And that's an interesting point, because actually this is not the only place in the country where they're looking at that. I think it's Mississippi or Alabama, they're looking at an extension of I-85 to accomplish essentially the same thing. I think in Missouri they're looking at the same kind of thing. It's a situation where they're frankly further down the road with that process than we are, even if that would be a way we would want to go. But it's an interesting idea.
Well, they should go talk to people in Florida, because they have tolls all over everywhere. But it would be great if you could extend I-85 all the way in here, because, hey, I'm from North Carolina.
It's sorry with you,
trying to cut across 158.
People to pay to come here.
Just done cut.
You're just going to have to hold your restroom visits till you pass Virginia, I guess.
The new governor just needs to be more creative. I like how he's thinking, but if he extends it a little bit and put those casinos on Fort Monroe, then you have a reason for people to come.
Now, I thought the casinos at Fort Monroe was a joke. I took that as a joke.
No, it's coming. Everything's on the table now.
No, you
everything's
do not
on the
really think
table.
that. You do not really think that, David Squires, do you?
It's coming.
We just
casinos.
through the spring
It'll be
April 1st,
casinos. It'll be a nature preserve and a great amusement park. Have a tie-in to Phoebus and a tie-in to Buckrow Beach, and Hampton Roads would be tourist destination.
Well,
and dinosaur zoo. And
yeah, okay.
Hey.
I was going to say, now my phones have lit up with all my Fort Monroe people who are just very unhappy that you have just said that.
Kathy, if I could jump in just
Please.
one quick point on transportation as well. well, just to bear in mind, is that the governor-elect, one, wants the state to push forward on the $3 billion in bonds that were included in House Bill 3202. The state has not moved forward with those yet because the insurance premium revenue stream that was supposed to be dedicated to pay back those bonds has, because of the recession, has not been coming in at the level that state leaders wanted it to. So one thing that we're talking about, and the governor-elect has talked about bonding debt in order to pay for some of these projects, particularly 460 with the public-private transportation partnership with some private builder, is Virginia going to go away from the historic and traditional 5% debt cap that it has always maintained? And that's a big question that not only the governor-elect will be wrestling with, but that members in the legislature will be wrestling with as well.
I think this is not the time I would want to be going to the General Assembly if there were, you know, it's a whopping $17,000 a year in pay for what seems to be an awful lot of work. But this is pretty challenging.
It's hard to rail against federal deficits when you're stepping up and doing it for yourself. Right. So you put them in a partisan bind. Yeah. That if they're going to take issue with Washington spending and with Barack Obama stimulus and all this different stuff, how can they step out and say, well, we're just going to lend ourselves $3 billion? You know, I mean, I think it makes for intellectual gymnastics.
Yes. And I think we'll be probably seeing a lot of that in the months ahead. Is this being viewed differently then in your coverage area, Kim, or are you seeing some of the same?
People really aren't talking about it yet because they're just sort of bracing for what will happen, because in the springtime, this past spring, people were saying this is really going to be bad. You know, you have no idea how bad it's going to be, and then poof, the federal stimulus money came and it all sort of went away. And then there was an election and, you know, not a huge turnout, and so now we're faced with where we were. And I think there are some people, perhaps not legislators, local legislators, but some people who think this too will go away.
So that something will come in at the 11th hour to make this kind of
the rescue. But the James City County Administrator, Sandy Warner, has been doing a tour of the districts in the county and saying, look, people, next year is as bad as the last 2 years combined. So some things are going to go. And there's been very light turnout. And
interesting.
Yeah, and people just don't seem ready to believe. Maybe if he wore a Santa suit or something, I don't know.
And as folks on the state level are looking at preparing the budget, I mean, the thing we hear over and over again is the revenues that we're looking at in the 11-12 two-year fiscal cycle are as low as they were in 05-06. And so what we're getting to, going back to Kimball's point about deficit spending, which the state doesn't do but the federal government does, we're getting to a point where there is probably going to be a very serious and fundamental debate about how Virginia spends money. And when you go down that path and you start cutting things, and that's what the governor-elect has talked about, you know, he wants limited government. He is adhering to, or says he will adhere to, those core conservative principles. If that is the case, what traditionally we have seen is when services are cut in bad economic times, they are reintroduced or phased back in. If this down economic period, but if this down economic period does not rebound, or rebounds much more slowly than anybody would like to see, are we getting to a point where the face of state government will be completely different than it ever has been before, and won't revert back to the kind of
there won't be a normal to come back to.
Right.
So what do you think is on the line if we're talking about this conversation about the core services of state government? What does that look like going forward? What's your
That's the problem, because you get guys who step out and say, you know, listen, there are no sacred cows.
Right.
We're going to take a zero-based budgeting and every single dollar. And I think you can have something where you make state agencies justify all their spending. I mean, listen, you're talking about billions of dollars. There's certainly waste, there's certainly fraud, there's certainly abuse, but you can't just sit there and point out this boogeyman in the corner that you can never get your hands around. That's why the whole rest stop thing has bothered me from the beginning, because if you're not willing to say, listen, we don't have the money, we're not going to staff these rest stops. And both the candidates, Creed Eads and Bob McDonald, and Bob did it again this week, saying, I'll have them open within 90 days. And it's like, Well, courage to you. You know, we're talking about schooling children and everywhere, and you're worried about snack machines and restrooms. And I realize that for people trucking through and driving through, it's a big deal.
Yeah, but you know, other states have found more creative ways to privatize it, and you know, there's ways to give you a
Remember,
place to.
we need congressional authority to do that, though.
Exactly so, but don't you think that's a situation where if the political will were there and you engaged your congressional delegation and the rest of it?
Well, how are we going to solve these other problems?
Such as?
Crime, more jobs, better bus systems across Hampton Roads?
I'm glad you raised the bus system question, because that's something that HRT is trying to get a lot of input on in terms of public transit. We've got the light rail that's coming close to getting ready in Norfolk. That public transportation thing is huge, and I don't know how we get our arms around that when we have a system where individual localities fund a regional transportation system, and they can either fund it or not according to whatever they want to do. I don't know how you get at that one. I think that's pretty tough.
No doubt it is tough.
But folks are out there.
But it's needed.
Yeah, folks are out there definitely having conversations about that. So, and this probably is one of those situations that in a stressed economic times could be interesting to see what the impact is.
You know, I hate to say this, but you know, I lived in Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, lived in New York, lived in Dallas, Fort Worth. You know, as hard as times are here, you know, we kind of got it a whole lot better than a lot of other places.
Well, that's a fact, yeah. I mean, you look at Miami, where something, I've forgotten what the stunning numbers on foreclosures are. We do, because of the defense industry, I suppose, have a little bit of a buffer for some of those really, really rough times. But still, you know, so many people in this community are either unemployed or underemployed. More importantly, not more importantly, but there's this sort of unaccounted for group that's underemployed, or what they call frustrated workers. That's what I think we're going to see. And there's some are full-time frustrated workers. I'm not saying anything.
Well, what do you think it's going to take to get people engaged, you know, to get actual citizens to start talking about this instead of it being an intellectual conversation in Richmond?
Well, people have to, I really think that people have to be scared into action. And you know, our unemployment numbers in this state are down. The latest number, I believe, is 6.3%, which is down from a high of just above 7% in the state. So our number is declining, but as you note, I mean, there are still thousands of people out of work. And the other thing is, the way that the unemployment rate is calculated in this state, it factors in the number of people who are receiving benefits. It is not necessarily factoring in those people who are kicked off the rolls because they've exhausted their period of benefit.
Or those, I don't know how it deals with young people just out of school who have never been able to find a job yet. You know, I mean, some of these don't even include a lot of those are pretty frustrated workers too.
But you know, it's interesting because this past election was one that saw positive gains for Republicans, both in Virginia and beyond. But Democrats would like to spin this. Republicans will tell you this is 1993 all over again, when Christy Todd Whitman won in New Jersey, George Allen won in Virginia. The next year, the Republican Revolution. But Democrats would tell you, no, it's closer to 2001. It's just an anomaly. It's a blip. I think the reality is that it's somewhere in between the two of those, but I think that voters, as we all are impatient, and they're basically saying, I don't care about party right now. I want you to get this situation solved. And if you're an incumbent, regardless of party, you're on your way out until this economy recovers and until I feel like my wallet or my pocketbook is padded again.
I want to thank all of you for being with us. We got to get this group together again. Thank you very much. We didn't solve anything, but I think we put it all on the table. How about that? I'll be back in just a moment with a final thought about one issue we did not discuss in our editorial roundtable. Were you watching this week when the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer became simply the PBS NewsHour? Well, the name change, along with a spiffy new set and some more web-based elements, are designed to attract a 21st century audience. But I hope this 21st century makeover isn't a subtle tipping of the show to the kind of news that we can find anywhere. I confess that's a bit of what I feared last week when Judy Woodruff spent a few sentences updating us on the Tiger Woods incident. I was still in the midst of trying to figure out whether this is even a story, so I was surprised that the NewsHour was tracking it. My take is that Tiger Woods is a guy who's lived as private a life as one can when you're one of the greatest athletes in the world. After all, when they had to come up with a name for their yacht, he and his wife chose the name Privacy to plaster across the stern. He had a very bad day, and I'm guessing he has a few more bad days to come. But he had that bad day within yards of his own home and his own driveway. And so it seems to me a domestic incident and a family crisis that they will either work out or they won't. Tough questions to ask indeed. Admittedly, it was just a few lines in a PBS newscast. But when the jobless rate nationwide is 10%, just under 7% in Virginia, when we're sending 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan, and when we're trying to hammer out a game-changing health bill, we can't afford a program as excellent as the NewsHour to waste even a single minute. If you have a comment about tonight's program, or if you want to watch any of our past broadcasts, you can log on to our website, whatmatters.tv, or send us an email. And be sure to sign up for our weekly e-bit so that you can see what we're working on in the weeks ahead. We're also on Facebook, so join us as a fan and leave your comments there as well. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, I hope you'll join us weekdays noon to 1 on 89.5 WHRV Public Radio for Hampton Roads for our public affairs program that's called Hearsay, noon to 1 on 89.5. And I appreciate your watching this broadcast. We always like to hear from you on this or any other issue, anything we've talked about in our editorial roundtable. I'm Kathy Lewis. We'll see you next time for another look at what matters.